Starting the live stream, starting the webinar in 3 seconds.
Good morning, good evening. I am Barbara Slavin. I direct the Middle East Perspectives program here at the Stimson Center. And I'm very grateful for all of you who are tuning in today. This is our fourth event addressing the consequences of the Hamas attack of last October 7th and the Israeli response. Each time I schedule one of these, I keep hoping we will be talking about the aftermath of the war. But unfortunately, 11 months in, that is not yet the case. The public discourse often seems dominated by hardline and extreme voices, but there are many supporters of peace and human rights in Israel among the Arab and Jewish community, and I think it's important to give them a platform, even if their goals remain elusive at this time. So we are honored to have a really wonderful panel joining us today, and I'm grateful they've taken the time to be with us. We're going to start with Dr. Dalia Scheinland. She is a political strategist and a public opinion researcher. She's advised political campaigns in Israel and in many other countries, working on elections, referendums, and public affairs issues. Dalia conducts extensive public opinion research for civil society organizations, including joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys. She has a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University and a master's from the Harvard Divinity School, which I think is an interesting combination. Next, we will hear from Ada Tuma Sliman, who hopefully has joined us now or is about to. Ada is a member of the Knesset representing the Hadash party and one of two Arab women in the Israeli parliament. She was first elected in 2015 and served as the chair of the Knesset Committee for the Status of Women and Gender Equality. She's a former newspaper editor, and she's been one of the strongest voices representing the Palestinian community in Israel, opposing Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, settlements, and attacks on Gaza civilians. Last but not least, we're honored to hear from Nadav Wyman. Nadav is the executive director of Breaking the Silence, which is an organization of Israeli veterans who work to expose the reality of life in the occupied territories and to end the occupation. Nadav served in a snipers team in the special forces of the Nahal Brigade and attained the rank of staff sergeant. He also worked as a history and literature teacher and was the legal guardian at a home for underprivileged teens in Tel Aviv. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with Dalia. The news of the past few weeks has been especially heartbreaking, with the Hamas execution of 6 young Israeli hostages amid the continued failure of ceasefire talks and dozens of Palestinian civilian deaths every day. We've also seen the biggest Israeli protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu, but they seem to have had little to no effect on his position. So, Dalia, where is the Israeli body politic? Are there viable alternatives to Israel's current course in the near term?
Thank you, Barbara, for the introduction. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience. How long would you like me to talk? Because when you open up these questions, I could really go on for an hour. Do you want to give me like
let's start with 5-10 minutes so that
5-10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, so we have time for the others. And I should have mentioned also for those who are watching, please submit questions to our speakers in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with by now. So go.
Okay, so I'm going to try in 5 minutes to give you headline insights about 4 different topics, and I'll do it really quite focused. First, I want to talk about the change in politics and public opinion with relation to the political scene, which will help set the stage. Then I'll talk about what I see as the shifts and stabilization of people's ideology in a broader way. Then I'll talk about where people are with relation to the specific questions of the war and policy and attitudes towards hostage release, and then maybe just wrap up by what we see on the streets. First of all, with relation to the political scene, what you have to realize is that the first thing that happened after the war is that the government plunged in terms of public opinion ratings. The prime minister, the government, his party trust in government in a generic way, and of course the coalition. That made it look like he was done. But those numbers were very consistent for about the first 6 months. Since roughly April, there has been a small and incremental but stable and continuing recovery for the prime minister. So he has stabilized, kind of plateaued now, roughly to where he was in all of the indicators I just mentioned before the war. He is not back up to where he was in the elections of November 2022. So his position is precarious, but better than it was in the first 6 months of the war. Moving quickly to the bigger sense of how Israelis look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and their ideology, which, self-definition of ideology is the question that I'm referring to here, which is very consistent in surveys. We ask it in most surveys, and it's a very good predictor of how people feel in the long term with relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, peace, two states, settlements, annexation. Everything can be predicted by people's ideology. And the first thing, well, not the first thing, but what usually happens in times of escalation is that Israeli Jews particularly move further to the right. That is what happened in terms of their self-identity after the Second Intifada, during or immediately after the outbreak of the Second Intifada throughout the 2000s, incrementally, usually from the left to the center, and then later to the right. And I expected that given the extreme nature of what's happening, we would see that. And in fact, that's roughly what we did see for the first number of months. What I've seen in recent months, okay, the war has gone on for so long that we have, plenty of trends to look at, is that there has been a bit of drifting back. In other words, people's self-defined ideology and their accompanying positions to some extent have stabilized. This is not a leftward shift. Society was, certainly majority right-wing before the war, and definitely among Israeli Jews, but there is some drifting back to the previous pre-war positions, so that I don't see yet an ongoing, unrestrained move to the right, not in terms of people's ideology, and not in terms of their positions so far, although support for a two-state solution in particular has certainly suffered among Jewish Israelis, not as much among Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel. So in terms of ideology, it's an interesting thing, and I can't totally explain it, but I can see that we can confirm it in a way. Both of the trends that I just mentioned, the recovery of the Likud and the prime minister and his government, and the stabilization of ideology, if we look at electoral surveys, because that's the most consistent survey we have. And we see that, again, the coalition parties have regained the ground they lost during the war to their pre-war position, but not as good as their 2022 actual voting result. And we also see that the far-right ultra-nationalist parties represented by religious Zionism and Jewish Power or Otzma Yehudit, these really Jewish supremacist parties, they are doing a tiny bit better than they were during 2023, but they are not able to recreate their 2022 election results in most surveys. Very few surveys, by my count, only one or two, maybe three throughout this whole time, have actually showed them doing better than the 14 seats they currently have. And I haven't seen those kinds of surveys in recent months at all. So for the most part, they are not able to even do as well as they did in the actual November 2022 elections. None of that is a prediction for where things will be when elections are called, but it is an indication of the trend, confirms the trend that I said. I don't see an unrestrained flow to the right. Let me move briefly into some policy observations with relation to public opinion. I'm going to focus on what I think is the biggest topical issue right now, which is attitudes towards a hostage release deal, which would involve the release of Palestinian prisoners and a ceasefire. Now, this question is asked in different ways over the course of the war because the terms under consideration keep changing. And yet, in every poll, every single time, there is either an absolute majority, over 50% of Israelis, who support a hostage release deal, no matter what the terms might be, or a plurality. So not 50%, but let's say 45, 48%, but significantly more than those who oppose it, which is usually around the 35% range. Some polls are as low as 29%. Some polls maybe show up to, 38, 40%, depending on the question being asked. But I have yet to see a single survey showing that more people oppose a hostage release and ceasefire deal than those who support it. And I think that's an important indication. What we also see with relation to that kind of public opinion dynamic is that support for a hostage release ceasefire deal cuts absolutely along political lines. The issue has become completely politicized. The politicization of the hostage question is complete. So among people who are supporting the parties of the current Israeli coalition, a majority are against it. A few people are for it, small percentages, but the majority are against it. And this majority rises the further the right, the more right-wing the party is perceived to be. So with Likud people who say they're voting for Likud, you have a majority, maybe 60%, who oppose the deal. Among supporters of religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit or Jewish power, you have something like 70 or 80% who oppose it, and similar for the ultra-Orthodox parties. And the opposite is true when people say they are voting for National Unity Party, which is sort of what Israelis perceive in the center right, or even the party of Avigdor Lieberman, which is firmly to the right, but not in Netanyahu's camp. The majority are for a deal, and it rises the more people perceive the party to be centrist and left-wing, and among the parties representing majority of Palestinian citizens in Israel. So that is, I think, an apt summary, because what we see, in order to get the majority who support the hostage release deal consistently across the board, that means there is always a portion of the right wing who support it, because the majority of Israelis are right wing. So you can't have, 100% of right wingers opposing a deal, or you would have a majority opposed to it, which means most of and I should also say from the outset that I should have said this in the beginning, that attitudes among Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel with almost everything related to the war are completely divergent. So every insight you can say about the majority of Israelis, usually it's the opposite among Palestinian citizens versus Jewish citizens, except with relation to a hostage release ceasefire deal. Again, you have a majority or a plurality among all Israelis. Also among Jews, it's usually a plurality, maybe a majority, but among Palestinian citizens, usually the highest support, because they don't oppose the ceasefire to begin with, and some of them are hostages, and this is the general orientation. I just want to say a word about the difference between polls and what we see on the street, or the similarities. In other words, in this case, what we see is a massive social movement that has, according to police estimates, 500,000 people came out to demonstrate this past Saturday evening, and that was the culmination of every single night of mass demonstrations throughout the course of time. So you could always say, well, demonstrations only represent a small part of society, but in this case, I would have to say they represent a majority of Israelis on the issue of hostage release in return for a ceasefire. I don't want to overstate the case. Most Israeli Jews would not support a ceasefire on their own. I don't have any evidence of that. There is widespread support for the justification of the war among Jewish Israelis, but that basic equation is shared by a majority. If it were not for the hostage deal, for the hostages, we would see much greater divergence of views, I think, with relation to a ceasefire. And the last thing I'll say is that with relation to the war itself, we have seen an erosion of confidence that Israel can achieve victory, primarily because people don't trust the prime minister. The majority do not trust him on this. They believe his decision-making is tainted by politics, according to surveys, and they do not know what victory means.
Okay, succinct and to the point. Let me continue now with Ada. I really, we talked about this a little bit before the event, but I'm just curious how you have been spending the last 11 months and what you have been able to do, given your minority status around the margins, to affect the public debate. And also, if I may, just a kind of practical question about the Knesset. I know you were just voting on something in the Knesset, and I thought the Knesset was out now until October. What are the dynamics like within that body now? And what is your sense of whether there is any chance for elections, for a dissolution of the Knesset, a vote of no confidence anytime soon? Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Actually, you're asking what I was doing in the last 11 months. I was very busy. I was doing a lot and yet doing nothing. Why I'm saying this? Because I've never, I think I felt that the situation is overwhelming and is almost making all of us emotionally and looking to the future actually paralyzed. Feeling that we are not able to specify what we are feeling. In the last 11 months before the 7th of October, I knew I'm part of a small minority, not only nationally, but politically also. And I knew that the principles and the values that I believed in, I might share some of them with the rest of the citizens or the politicians, but mainly most of them is not shared by any of those who are surrounding me in the Knesset. But I've never felt or gone through what we have been going through in the last 11 months. The amount of oppression and silencing that has been practiced in Israel, especially against the Palestinian community and us as politicians who are representing them, and especially because of our opposition to the war from the beginning, saying it very clearly that there is no militaristic solution to the situation we are in. And there has to be a political solution. And there is no way, with all the agony and the fear and the stress that we felt after 7th of October, and we understood that it is a big trauma, but also we understood that no war will solve this problem for the long run. And there is no such a thing of a total victory. And there is no way militaristic wise, you will be able to smash huge parts of the military power of Hamas. But as long as there is occupation, and as long as there is oppression, and as long as there are people who are hopeless, the idea of Hamas will continue to grow, or will continue to exist at least. That, because we echoed those voices and because we revealed from the beginning the crimes committed also in Gaza during the war, I was suspended for 2 months from the Knesset as a punishment for speaking about bombing a Shifa hospital, which week later, everybody was bragging that we are bombing the hospitals. We were forbid to bring any of our voices to the public sphere. For example, almost none of the media in Israel has interviewed me or any of my colleagues. Almost none. Maybe 2 or 3 interviews for the 5 of us. And mainly we are brought to the studio in order to be crucified. The other issue is that we were forbidden to hold any demonstration. Every time we needed to protest, like we had to go to the Supreme Court because the police will not authorize. Even when we thought to go by the law and to have a protest of less than 50 people, which we don't need a permission from the police, the leadership of the Arabs Palestinians were arrested on the spot, including the head of the High Follow-up Committee, which is an umbrella organization, including former MKs and heads of parties. All of them were arrested on the spot in order to avoid us from having any protest. Till now, we are facing the same. Many of our community were arrested under the claim of supporting terror because they might have posted a version of the Quran and someone misinterpreted it. And many of the students were again stopped from studying in the university. Some were even we were forced that some of the young women who were arrested because they posted something about Gaza in their Facebook, they were forced to be included in the first agreement of exchange of hostages and prisoners. And they are not convicted yet. They didn't press any charges against them, but they included, the Israeli government included them in the deal of exchange. And now those young women are already known in their university, in their workplace, as released in Hamas agreement of exchange, which will avoid them of any progress in their professional or academic life. So what I was telling you is that under these circumstances, I found myself someone who has been, legislating and promoting issues and doing really a lot of work, doing two things mainly. Running to protect my community from one place to another, and second, to protest against the war, if it is by writing, if it is by speaking, or by speeches given in the Knesset. I knew from the beginning that there won't be a big audience of who will listen to what we have to say, but I felt historically we need to have that voice and to echo it and to find a way to bring together all of us who are against the war. That's how, for example, we created what we call a coalition that is called Partnership for Peace, which include all the organizations who are anti-occupation and anti-war, and we are working together and promoting things together. But what I wanted to say is, I agree with Dalia that not all of those who are supporting a release of hostages are supporting to stop the war. And for my regret, we have seen in the last 2-3 days in the demonstrations signs and slogans that say, Rafah can wait, but they cannot. Meaning, let's free the hostages and then the government can continue its horrible, horrible war on Gaza. And that's why I think that not everyone who is declaring that he is supporting freeing the hostages in the polls really means that he wants to free, because it's the most human, moral thing to say it. But when it comes with an agreement, then they will say, no, this agreement is not because it's going to stop the war. This agreement is not because we cannot continue with our programs. That's why I'm telling you there is a need now to do exactly what we have been doing, trying to protect our community, especially with all the legislations and policies that are really, large part of them are fascist policies and anti-democratic. And on the other hand, to stand still and speak out, what we used to say in the beginning of the war was not accepted at all. Today, more and more people are realizing that, yes, there is no militaristic solution, and there is a need for a political solution. Of course, they are not yet the majority, but
Let me ask you again the just sort of practical question about the Knesset and whether there can be a motion of no confidence and so on.
Yeah.
What would be
I forgot to
required?
answer that one.
Yeah, is there any indication that this coalition that has kept Netanyahu in power all this time is wobbly at all or not?
In my opinion, this a very solid, strong coalition. And I don't see any motion of unconfidence is going to pass in the Knesset. This coalition based its power and its possibility to continue together on two things. On one hand, it is for the first time in 20, 25 years, or even from the beginning, if we do not consider the time when it was very short government, for the first time there is a fully right wing and even, extreme right wing government that agree on the basic ideological basis. And they understand that if they go to election now, many of them will be out of the government, will not be included in the next government. So that's why most of them are willing to compromise in the last minute in order to keep that coalition. The other base that this coalition rely on in its strength is the weakness of the opposition, is the fragmentization of the opposition. And to tell you the truth, the fact that the opposition is not suggesting or daring to bring any new political project to the citizens that can save them from the hands of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is very charismatic. Netanyahu is a very good liar. And Netanyahu is telling them what he wants to do. On the other hand, the opposition, instead of dealing with the real problems of Israel, is dealing with Netanyahu is corrupted and Netanyahu is like this, and the parties want to take more budgets. They are not bringing an alternative path to the people, and they are fragmentized because part of them also are very much in the right, or even those who are in the so-called opposition, they are very much in the center. They are not really center. Center of Israel is very much in the right. So, yes.
All right, I appreciate that. That's helpful. I'm going to turn now to Nadav. First, just tell us something about your organization, Breaking the Silence, and how you came to join it, and how you tried to influence the public discourse and the military, the IDF in Israel, ordinary members, leadership, veterans, reservists, and so on.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Dalia and Ida. It was a pleasure to hear you speak about the situation. So Breaking the Silence, organization of ex-soldiers. We were member of the IDF, or still members of the IDF, soldiers that serve in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And what we have in common, all of us, is that we are against the Israeli occupation. We stood in checkpoint, we raided homes, we fought in Gaza, we enforced curfew, arrested kids, we did all of that. And we know how the occupation is immoral, illegal, and how bad it is to the Palestinian society and the Israeli society. And what we try to do is we take our stories, the commands that we got, the operation that we took part in, and we use it as a tool, as an educational tool. So we're leading tours to the West Bank, Hebron, the South Lebanese area, different lectures about how the occupation ticks, how it works, because everybody in Israel, and I've got to say also outside of Israel, think about the smoke screen of security. Does it bring security if it not brings it? No. The occupation is a tool of controlling Palestinians, controlling the Palestinian land and Palestinians. For what? That's a good question. If we want to build more settlements, if we want to annex, or I don't know what. But that's the hard cold fact. Now, we exist for the past 20 years. This June was the very sad 20th anniversary of breaking the silence. We have over 1,500 testifiers from all of the different units that serve in the West Bank and Gaza. We do about 500 educational events a year, bringing about 20,000 people to the West Bank in a normal year that you don't have a war or COVID or things like that. And I've got to say that as an organization, we don't want to influence the IDF. I'm not here to make the IDF a better occupying army. And I think basically the IDF is not the problem. The problem is our government's giving the IDF commands to do so. Yes, along the years, the IDF has its own policy. And the IDF does a lot of things that sometimes are against what the state of Israel wants. Because the force that you have as a commander on the ground in the West Bank in front of Palestinians, it's almost unlimited. And I've got to say that breaking the silence since 2008, we're collecting also testimonies about Gaza. And our first publication about Gaza was 2009 after Operation Cast Lead. And after that, we published again about Operation Protective Edge in 2014. And now we're working very, very hard to publish as much things as possible on Gaza. And I've got to say that, Barbara, personally, I have something with Gaza. I served in the special forces in a snipers team, as you mentioned, but I fought in Gaza in 2008 and again in 2012 as a reservist. And being over there as a reservist in 2012, that what made me basically to come to breaking the silence. Because then I understood that it's not about security. It's not about suppressing a terror organization. It's more than everything is about control and controlling Palestinians. And that's our number one goal in breaking silence. We try to end the Israeli occupation. And again, through political education.
Thank you. I'm going to start looking at some of the questions that are coming in. Yeah, this is the one that comes up, and I know we're in an election season in the United States, and so my hopes are not high, but it's the question, what can the United States do? What more can the United States do? I think we have to give credit that the U.S. has been trying to achieve a ceasefire and a hostage release now since the beginning of the war, had a brief success last November, but obviously nothing since then, despite many optimistic comments by U.S. officials and from at various times. So let me ask each of you in turn, starting with you, Dalia, is there anything more you would like to see the U.S. do? What do you realistically expect? There are folks who talk about arms embargoes, but of course we saw the huge response when Biden simply paused the delivery of 2,000-pound bombs. So let me start with you.
Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I wish I had, a way to make my magical wish list come true. I don't think I can guarantee that anything I would propose is particularly realistic for the US right now. If they were realistic, the US would have done them already. We've had administrations that expressed, strong moral support for a peace process, for ending occupation, for reaching a two-state solution. If they weren't able to put policy ideas behind them sufficiently to get there, I'm not sure why we expect them to change. So I have to qualify anything that I can say. But I do think that in the US, there are a few things that are both immediate policy steps that can be realistically taken. And then, maybe different ways of thinking about the longer term vision or framing the policy aims of the US. So, for example, the idea about an arms embargo sounds tremendously scary to Israelis, to Jewish American constituencies, or even the majority of Israelis or plurality of Americans who support Israel. We should remember that America overall in surveys, we see consistently that there is more support for Israel than Palestinians, and so anybody in the Israeli Jewish community or in the American Jewish community who thinks that Israel's under attack in the U.S. is missing the bigger picture. And an arms embargo does sound extreme, but the U.S. has laws in existence that it can, not just can, but that it needs to apply equally to all of its foreign military exports. These are laws that are applied in Ukraine, and they should be applied in Israel as well. And they simply do what the UK has announced that it will do, which is review all of its military, all of the uses of its military exports to make sure they aren't violating international law, particularly with relation to international human rights law. And America has those laws on the books. It's not good for American society to apply those laws unequally to different cases. So that's one thing. And also in the very immediate sense, I have a particular let's just call it my little pet issue that it's so strange that it feels like my little pet issue because it is something that affects every Israeli and Palestinian, and that has to do with public health. There is a massive crisis in Gaza right now. It is a water and sanitation crisis. It is leading to an outbreak of diseases. We've seen the resurgence of polio. And this is, there aren't enough superlatives to describe how devastating it is for Gaza. But if Israelis think it's going to be limited to Gaza, that is totally a misunderstanding of how epidemiology works. And the U.S. may be completely paralyzed in its ability to actually bring about a ceasefire or a two-state solution for that matter. But in addition to working on humanitarian aid, there needs to be immediate attention to public health, to the public health crisis, which will entail pressuring Israel to make sure that the basic medical, sanitary, water, et cetera, conditions are getting through, including fuel to help power those basic infrastructure. I mean, the U.S. has done some of this, Israel has done some of it, but none of it is enough. And that's another reason why America should be pressing for a ceasefire. So those are some very immediate things. In the bigger long term, I mean, the idea that I think that the Biden administration at least had an appropriate vision for trying to look at the broader regional incentives for getting Israel to get to a ceasefire and eventually trying to bind that together with longer term normalization as incentive, but it didn't work. And I think what we need to do is look at the bigger picture of the regional need for de-escalation in terms of the U.S. supporting a series of agreements. Okay, the U.S. is already working on the track with Hezbollah through the Hochstein process, we call it. There needs to be a series of agreements. Israel and Hezbollah, Israel and Hamas have to come to an agreement about a ceasefire. I don't care what we call that kind of negotiation that gets there with hostage release and a ceasefire. If that goes along with Israel-Saudi normalization, if that is the incentive that brings about the other two things, that can be a third leg of it. And I think ultimately, Barbara, of course, you are the expert, but I think ultimately neither Israel nor the region will ever see a path towards stability if there isn't some sort of revival of diplomacy with Iran. I think that we should all have learned right by now just how disastrous the death of diplomacy was with Iran. Okay, and I don't disagree with the prime minister, with Netanyahu, when he says that Iran is behind a lot of the aggression going on now. But we have to understand how we got there. There was a diplomatic process in place. Iran had incentive to restrain itself. That incentive was destroyed with America breaking its own word on diplomacy. That was bad for American diplomacy, and it was bad for the region. Now, none of this is going to change overnight. Iran is not a good actor, and I don't think it will, restrain all of its nefarious policies overnight. But those prongs have to be part of a bigger strategy. Otherwise, we are headed towards possibly a multi-pronged war, if not a multi-pronged series of agreements.
Thank you for that, and thank you for raising the question of Iran, which, as you know, I focus on a great deal. Iran now has a new president who has expressed an interest in de-escalation, and it did not escape our notice that Israel chose to assassinate Ismail Haniyeh after he had just attended the inauguration of this new president, which certainly was not exactly a vote of confidence in what the future could bring in terms of diplomacy. And let me turn to you. We have seen from and heard from Kamala Harris some expressions of sympathy, of compassion for Palestinians. She has been a bit more empathetic than Joe Biden has been. Is there any hope, any sense that she might be able to deliver? Is there concern among the Palestinian community, perhaps not to be too supportive of her because it might cause a backlash by pro-Israel or pro-Bibi voters? I'm just curious how you're regarding our electoral process, and if you think there's anything the U.S. can do in the next few months to help change the situation in Israel, Gaza.
That was for me, Barbara?
Yes, it was for you. What do you hope for from the American political process?
Well, I have to say that I think differently a little bit about the U.S. administration, and although I'm fully aware of the differences between a Republican administration and a Democrat administration, but eventually there are historical ties between Israel and the United States of America. And it's very clear that the United States of America under any administration is not an objective partner in that in any process that is happening, but it has very it has been an alliance of all the Israeli governments, including Netanyahu's government, despite the, let's say, the tension that existed before the 7th of October and after the 7th of October. But still, the United States administration or Biden administration gave a full support. This war couldn't have gone that far without the financial and military support given by Biden administration to Israel. And if this war have gone so far, the reaction and the way to stop it should go also far, and not in the usual way. And I think that Biden's administration, if they did not wait till the last minute in the last 2 months, meaning exactly after we have been trapped now in the elections situation where everybody needs to do calculation in the United States. In Israel, things can be erupted in two ways, either by Israeli election or American election. in both situations, the political arena and the possibility to move and to create a different situation is interrupted. In my opinion, I do not think that Kamala Harris is going to define by herself the policy that will be led toward the Middle East. And I think it is controlled by many other issues. She needs now to be more sympathetic and to show sympathy to the Palestinian situation, because, she is not, probably this is the population that she wants to draw back to her election campaign. I'm not sure how the Palestinians or pro-Palestinian activists in the United States are going to act in the next election. Maybe they are keeping it low profile, and when they will feel the danger of having Trump in the administration, they will act immediately in order to protect the situation. Nobody, I mean, at least I'm not a very big expert on the American situation, but I believe that there were more steps to be taken, including, saying it very clearly that the administration is not going to support and to continue to support the militaristic actions, the war, the genocide that is happening in Gaza. I mean, they know that this is in their hands, and this is the only way that might bring people to think. Sorry, Annie, I know that it will make the Israelis feel insecure, but meanwhile, tens of thousands of Palestinians are killed, and the escalation of the situation might lead us to a regional war. And it is not only because of Iran, mainly Iran, to tell you the truth, I'm amazed they have been restraining themselves, because I think they want and they understand that they will lose a lot. But look what happened tonight. I mean, Israel bombed in Syria in 3 places and killed more than 15 people and injured 60. These provocations should stop. None of us, neither the citizens of Israel or the other people in the region, can tolerate a regional war now. And I think it's up to the United States to interfere there were different stops during the 11 months where Biden administration protected Israel from any criticism or a real decision in the UN on this. And I'm sure they are also protecting and trying to influence the ICCI and the ICJ. But this cannot continue like this. This is a kind of not only being complicit, but in partnership in this war. And it needs to be stopped. I don't know, someone is trying to think that maybe Biden, in the period of time between election and turning over the presidency, he might do something. In Arabic, we have a very famous way of saying, if it was about to rain, we would have seen the clouds. And sorry to end it in such a way, but I mean,
No, thank you.
Not expecting a lot from the administration.
Yeah. Nadav, you were recently in the States. You came to do a little counter programming while Bibi was addressing a joint session of Congress. Anything that you might be able to foresee that is practical, that could put some weight on the scale toward a ceasefire, toward a hostage release, and toward de-escalation?
Yes. So first of all, we talked about weapons. So for 3 long years, when I served in the Israeli commandos, I had an M16, and it was engraved on the side, "Property of U.S. government." Most of my equipment as a soldier was American made, right? So and the position of Israel over here in the Middle East is very strategic to the US, and the US is our biggest friend in the world. So I think, yes, the Biden administration has a lot of leverage on Israel. And we saw it in the sanctions, right? Because we're talking about Gaza, but while Gaza is happening, we have increased settler violence in the West Bank. Again, I'm an activist in the West Bank for more than 10 years, and we never saw this amount of violence. So we had 17 Palestinian communities that fled from settler violence, left their village, and just ran away because of that violence. And then something happened that even us as Israeli activists, I never thought it would happen, that Joe Biden would say Israel and sanctions in the same sentence. And that changed a lot of things. First of all, for us as Israeli activists that are trying to speak about settler violence, for years they accused us it's not really true, and it's an invention of left-wing NGOs. No, it is true, and it really affects Palestinians. More than 7 Palestinians since October 7th were murdered by settlers in the West Bank, right? I'm not talking about Palestinians that were killed by soldiers, only by settlers. And we have 5 more that we're not sure if it's Israeli soldiers or settlers. And that tells you a lot about how the situation is built in the West Bank. Because after October 7th, a lot of army units, special army units that are called Hagmar, regional defense, were recruited. And what does it mean? It means settlers doing their reserve duty in their settlement. So they are super duper political soldiers. And what happened? Increased violence. from the army, not only from settlers. And now you don't know, again, me as an Israeli, as an ex-soldier, I don't know if the soldier that is stopping me in the road in, I don't know, the South Hebron Hills area, is a settler that is dressing up as a soldier, or actually a settler on reserve, because I know them for so many years and they're so violent, and now they're carrying brand new weapons that they got, right? So I think what Biden did, choosing, first of all, violent settlers, to impose sanctions on them, to flag Israel. Listen, just enforce law on those violent settlers. That's it. And when that didn't work, starting sanctions on outposts, which is a business, right? And what we believe is that we need more of those, right? We need to increase the sanctions. You have so many other actors that are helping violence in the West Bank, right? So that's one thing. And Dalia mentioned before that laws. You have the Leahy law, right? It's a very, every unit in the IDF, as I had an M16 property of US government. So you have Humvees, right? And you have night goggles and you have ammunition and all of that. And if your unit is dealing with crimes, I don't know, attacking Palestine, murdering, all of that. So the Leahy law is very, very, very specific about that, right? So I think that for us as Israeli activists or as political activists, over here in Israel, Palestine, sanctions really helped us, And now we have part of the opposition, small parts of the opposition, using those sanctions to flag to their voters, listen, this is the problem, which I don't think settler violence is the only problem, but it's a good way to start speaking about the problem. So the US has a lot of things that they can do even more over here.
I appreciate that comment on sanctions and their use in terms of the settlements and also raising the West Bank. Believe it or not, we have only 10 minutes left. So I want to deal with the other aspect, which a number of people have raised in the Q&A, and that is the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, Geneva Conventions, and so on, the use of international law as opposed to US law. Now, the United States obviously is not a member of the ICC. The US has exerted a lot of influence, presumably, to keep the ICJ from issuing warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, even though they've been indicted. We have seen, however, European governments speak of these international institutions and invoke international law. We've also seen a number of smaller European countries recognize the state of Palestine. Just curious, moving away from US action for a moment, how do you see these various international institutions? How can you use them to support your efforts? And also, if you would say a word about the Europeans, we see that the British are now reviewing some arms sales, which is something new. And so you each have about 4 minutes to give us your views on that. And once again, we'll go in the order that we started. So Dalia, you're first.
Hi. Well, my biggest concern is that the Israel-Palestinian case will destroy the international institutions before the international institutions manage to, change policy in the region. Having said that, I do think this is an opportunity for the rest of the world to recommit to those institutions. Those, for example, I just remember the case that when the International Criminal Court pointed out, or opened investigations into British practice during the Iraq War, the British government reacted and said, we defend our position, we think we're not guilty, but we completely support the investigation of the International Criminal Court because that's what they do. And these are the kinds of attitudes that the international community has to do. They have to stand by international institutions and what they stand for, what those institutions stand for. They have to de-exceptionalize the Israeli-Palestinian war, conflict, and explain that this is what international institutions are there to do, is to hold all countries accountable. This is not a matter of singling out Israel. This is a matter of bringing back Israel from a very privileged position that it's enjoyed within the international community. I know that sounds strange to much of the pro-Israel crowd, but Israel has been doing things that violate international law for decades without facing any of the kinds of sanctions or, investigations, et cetera, international courts that we've seen. And so I think that one thing is that even if the wheels of justice turn very slowly with great controversy, even that's not exceptional. I have never seen a country that was the target of international investigations take it nicely, except for the UK. Okay, but I mean, when they're serious, they're all serious. I'm just saying it's normal to be defensive about this. It's normal for the country who's being investigated to, feel defensive and rejectionist, but it's also normal for them to be investigated and on trial for violations of international law. And I think that this is the time for the international community to recommit to it, because otherwise, let's face it, those international institutions were already on very shaky ground. Russia's challenge to the international system was huge. And, there was a great sort of international rallying from the Western world, but it's done a lot to alienate those parts of the world that were already alienated, because they were the ones who were generally being put on the dock in international institutions. And so I really think the world has to decide if it recommits to them or not. I would like to see this as an opportunity for America to join the International Criminal Court. Haha. But you told me to focus on realistic things, so I won't get into it too much. But I think that's what the world should be asking itself at this time. I don't really think that the changes are going to happen, or that, there's, maybe I'll just backtrack 1 second. I was going to say that the wheels of justice of international courts, certainly with America putting its thumb on the scales, is not going to, have an impact in time to end this war in Gaza when it needs to end, which is yesterday. However, I do think that the Israeli government lives to some extent in fear of the proceedings becoming more severe. And there's kind of a collective at the political level, kind of collective suppression for right now, the fact that warrants could come from the ICC any day now. And as I know you said, America is certainly working behind the scenes for that not to happen. But I have little doubt that the government is aware of that and is working to try to avoid it. And it leads to cynical statements such as, you hear a lot of debate now in Israel about why it's so important for the judiciary to remain independent, so that Israel can be seen as fulfilling the complementarity principle, able to prosecute its own potential wrongdoers in times of war. And that's a cynical approach. But at this point, I'll take what I can get. If that has any impact on either Israel supplying more humanitarian aid to Gaza, which it has somewhat, or the policymakers being more aware of the limitations, even in wartime, for the protection of international humanitarian law, et cetera, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Ada, let me ask you about the Europeans in particular. We have seen, as I said, several countries recognize Palestine. We've also seen the British action and so on. Are you hopeful that at least from the European side we may see more support? There are obviously some countries like Germany which have been perhaps only second to the United States in supporting Israel in recent months, but we have Ireland, we have Spain, Norway. Anyway, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I agree very much with Dalia about the international institutions and how important to the world to defend those institutions and recommit itself to it after so many years of impunity to Israel. As to the I wanted to ask you, Barbara, is it by chance that every time that you say recognize Palestine, in quotation, recognize the state of Palestine? If we might forget, because there are a lot of things happening, but the state of Palestine is recognized by around 150 states in the world. So it's good that some of those who were reluctant or did not support for political reasons, they are supporting now and recognizing the state of Palestine. And it's very important why I'm saying this, because it's different when you talk about by law, when you are talking about a state occupying another state, than when it's occupying people. Anyway, the EU, I would like to give you a small story that happened 2 or 3 days ago. Mr. Borrell wanted to visit Israel and Palestine as part of, last of his last minute efforts, maybe to bring a message, especially that he is leaving the office in November. The Israeli government has informed him after they informed the Israeli government that he wants to come to a visit, that they are not able. The Israeli government is not able to provide him with any security or any of the diplomatic protocol that happens in this visits. Actually, it is as if saying to Mr. Borrell, a persona non grata in Israel. And of course, Borrell had to cancel his visit to Israel. Now, this is the EU. He is one of the highest representatives of the European Union, which is a big also provider, one of the biggest partners in trade with Israel, and a big provider of support through different agreements that is signed by Israel and the EU. And by the way, Israel is committing itself by those agreements for protecting human rights. It's just a sentence written, it looks like, in the agreement, and nobody is following if Israel is obeying that or not. And they are still able to tell the Minister of Foreign Affairs almost that you will not be accepted in Israel.
Yeah, that's quite something.
This is going beyond all what is accepted diplomatically and in international relations. And I would like to see what the EU is going to do after they got that kind of insult in such a very, vague way. What is happening is that it need only one a state out of the 28 states of the EU to say no for any decision or any statement in order to cancel this. The veto, the right of veto for the members, even if all the rest are agreeing. That's why the EU is not taking any step, because there is Germany, there is Hungary, that are always blocking any kind of pressure that can be used. Of course, we have seen that with the sanctions against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that they tried to promote, and others. I think there is a possibility, just to say one sentence, there is a possibility by using those agreements that Israel signed with the EU, and to say very clearly, at least to start an investigation if Israel is really obeying democracy values and human rights. That would be enough.
Okay. Now, Dov, we're over time, but I wanted to give you one last word, if you on your view of these international institutions and also of European countries, what more they could do.
Yeah, so I'll do it very quickly. Of course, we support the ICC and ICJ. We want justice. We believe in international justice, and we believe in human rights. I've got to say something about the member states of the EU. Immediately after October 7th, they cut funding to almost all of the Israeli and Palestinian organizations to check if they are linked to terror or I don't know what. Now, we need our Palestinian partners. We need the Palestinian NGOs. We need them to be funded by the EU and by different member states, because we need a thriving civil society on the other side, just as we have in Israel. And that's my call for the European countries, to refund them. They refunded UNRWA, right, after they stopped. The American administration didn't, right? The American administration need to refund UNRWA as well. UNRWA is very important. But there is something so important with Palestinian partners of us that I can call and ask questions, and when we bring delegation from Europe or from the United States, so they can meet all of us. And for that, we need an ecosystem of NGOs. So supporting Palestinian NGOs.
Thank you so much. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I think there are some very good practical suggestions and areas for follow-up in what you've all said. So thank you for taking time from your busy schedules. I hope when I next encounter all of you, there is a ceasefire and the hostages have been freed, and we can finally begin to talk about what comes next. But thank you for your work. There are many people all around the world and in the United States who appreciate what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
hosting.
you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Stimson. And thank you to all of those watching, and we'll see you soon.